girls, welcome to another episode of Honda Street Garage. Today I am driving to Florida. I have a 6-hour drive and I thought I'd do a little bit of a vlog. I'm going to end up kind of yelling through this, I'm sure, because of the road noise, and I don't really have one of those nice fancy microphones. What I wanted to talk about today was the Fast and the Furious, but not Fast 8, The Fate of the Furious, because there's going to be reviews about that movie all over online, you know, telling you that it's either lost its way, or it's a big Dodge commercial, or that it's not a great movie, or that it is a great movie. So I didn't really want to add to that same type of review of like, oh, Fast 8, blah, 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 blah. But really what I wanted to talk about was the first movie and what it was like when it came out. Mostly because a lot of automotive YouTubers are pretty young and probably weren't around when the first Fast and the Furious movie came out, let alone, you know, were driving or were into the import underground scene. You know, back then, before the movie came out, you know, there was magazines. You had magazines to really go off of. The internet was really in its infancy as far as like car forums, and there was a lot of information that was bullshit that was out and about. And not only that, back then, you know, you didn't have eBay, and it was very difficult to get a hold of parts. So anybody that had, you know, something like a set of DC Sport headers, you know, that was a big deal back then because they were really expensive. Everybody's seen it 100 times, and everything about the movie has been, you know, mulled over and you know, blown up out of proportion. The fact is that, you know, that movie back in that day, to me, doesn't get a lot of credit, because if you really think about it and you look back in time, the Fast and the Furious was America's last great summer movie before 9/11. It was before, you know, the world got crazy. Back then you had the underground import racing. And I remember seeing a trailer for the movie at another movie because I have a friend who was really into movies, and I'd go with him to see movies all the time, and he was a big film person. At the time, Vin Diesel was probably the most famous actor, along with Jordana Brewster. Jordana Brewster was in like daytime, you know, soap operas. So everybody else was kind of an unknown actor at the time. Paul Walker had only been in a few movies here and there, you know, but it wasn't like the star that he became. The funny thing about the movie is that no one really expected the movie to do that well. It was based on an underground, you know, subculture, and, you know, a lot of people really didn't expect it to kind of blow up the way it did. I saw the movie 3 times in theaters. I was really excited about this movie because, you know, it was kind of showing something that you really couldn't get anywhere else. The first time that I went and saw the movie in the theater was opening night, and really it wasn't that packed, it wasn't that busy. However, a few days after that, about a week after that, they started putting more and more trailers out, and the movie started to do really well. And of course, you know, later on they did more focus on, you know, the Civic going underneath the truck and things like that. And I think that really, you know, pushed it over the edge as far as people wanting to go see it. And then the second time I went to go see the movie, the theater was absolutely packed, and people were, you know, yelling and screaming. I'll never forget being in the theater, you know, the moment where you realize that Brian was a cop, and just to hear the gasps in the audience like, no, no, he can't be, no. And even though the movie, you know, is a far cry from what eventually became of the series, it was a great movie for its time because it was believable. And that was the thing about it. You know, of course there's some things in the movie that are movie magic, you know, the 10-second quarter miles, the eclipse flying through the air, you know, things like that. But for the most part, it was a believable kind of plot. Basically, undercover cop goes in to try to bust some street racers that have been stealing stuff. It was just a cool movie to go watch, and it was really great to see, you know, imports kind of get, I guess, the recognition that they deserved at that time. You know, since that movie, basically all these other, all the American car manufacturers wanted to get a piece of the action. And that's why you have what you have today with, Fast 8. The fact is that you had all this brand loyalty. You had guys in there that were like, yeah, I'm going to do my Eclipse that way, or these Civics are fucking awesome. What's really odd about the movie is the fact that back then, people didn't really care for the Supra as much as they do today. You could get an RX-7, the last generation, relatively cheap, and a Supra and even NSX as well at the time. Other than the exotic cars that today are worth a lot of money, like the NSX, the Supra, and the RX-7, they're extremely expensive today. Back then, though, along with the fact that those cars were much cheaper than they are today, the other crazy thing is that, the NSX had 300 horsepower, and the Supra, oh look, there goes the Supra. And the Supra really didn't have that much more at the time. The 1,000 horsepower, mark didn't really kind of come up until a few years after that. But the other thing is, back then, 300 horsepower was considered insane. A lot of people ask why I don't really feature Accords or Preludes, H Series, F Series. But at the time of the very first Fast and the Furious movie, when that came out, I was driving a 94 Accord 4-door, lowered on 17-inch wheels. It was white, had white wheels, had the high wing. It was a 5-speed EX model. And that thing would get down for its time. People weren't really swapping engines back then quite yet. I mean, it was around, but it was quite rare. Back then you had car meets, I guess. We didn't really call them car meets. It was just, people would start showing up on a Saturday night at a certain place, and cops would chase us off. They really would. Whether it was at the movie theater, whether it was at, a local Hobby Lobby or whatever it was, once the cars got about 20, 30 deep, the cops would show up and chase us off. Even back then with doing street racing, it was more about the fun factor of it, the bragging rights. A lot of old school import guys that were in that scene will tell you that the movie kind of ruined everything. Because once the movie came out, cops really were becoming aware of what was going on, and they were really cracking down on it. They were looking for any, imports or any loud exhaust, lowered wheels, whatever. You were getting scrutinized. The other thing is that, the street races started to become more prevalent after the movie, and a lot of, I guess, fanboys, if you want to call it that, got involved. They went to their parents and they said, Mom, I want a Honda Civic, or I want an Eclipse, or whatever it was, and they got involved. And then, when they didn't go out and win races, they started getting upset. And then, guns started to show up, and shit started to get dangerous and out of control. Whereas before the movie came out, it was much more of a sense of camaraderie among people that were just into something. But it was a great time, and then 9/11 happened, and it was crazy. And then 6 months later, about Christmas time, is when the DVD came out. Everybody rushed out. Like, I remember I had to go to 3 or 4 places to get, to buy the DVD because it was sold out everywhere. But at that time, being in the scene, it just changed everything. Don't get me wrong, I've been arrested for street racing more than once. Hence the reason why you don't really see me do a bunch of racing on this channel. But just to drive the point home that they didn't think that it was going to be such a great movie or such a big, concept of a movie, the director and Vin Diesel didn't come back for Too Fast, Too Furious, which, most fans were like, oh God, they ruined it. Too Fast, Too Furious, I'm sure a lot of people will agree that it's just the worst of the movies. There's a lot of things that just went wrong with Too Fast, Too Furious. And then, of course, everybody said, all right, that's it. Let's abandon this bucket of crap. And then somewhere along the way, somebody figured out, let's make it about drifting. Take it to Japan. And, of course, they had the worst, lead actor of all time. But Tokyo Drift is probably one of the most enjoyable movies from the car perspective, you know, to really see the drifting and the cars. It was super enjoyable, so that movie actually ended up doing really well. Then, of course, Paul Walker attempted to do a few other movies and obviously just didn't have that, you know, gravitas that, you know, Fast and the Furious had for his career. But basically, they kind of realized, like, look, let's finish the storyline. Let's do this. They put out, you know, Fast and the Furious 4. People flocked to the theater because they wanted to know how the story ended. You know, what happened between Brian and Mia? What happened to Letty? What happened to Vince? You know, 4 was pretty good. People wanted to know what happened with the story. And then 5. 5 is probably the most enjoyable for everybody. 6, things got crazy in 6. And then, of course, the final chapter for Brian O'Connor, Paul Walker, was Fast and the Furious 7. And I gotta be honest, you know, it was hard to watch. I waited till the crowds kind of died down for that to go see it, so that I could kind of go see it, you know, on my own, and, you know, just watch it and get the reaction, you know, the honest reaction I had. And for me, it closed the chapter to it. I'll admit that Fast and the Furious 7 was a bit over the top as far as stunts, as far as, you know, the action is concerned. It was really over the top. You know, the send-off that they gave Brian, you know, was the right one. And for me, that was the, you know, end of an era. You know, the first Fast and the Furious movie, you know, kind of lended itself to that outlaw attitude of street racing. You know, camaraderie among, you know, friends over something like cars. Obviously, things have just gotten way out of proportion with how things have grown, but, you know, they've become action movies. And that's fine, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But with all that being said, you know, even when I watch the first one, it takes me back in time, and it's always an enjoyable experience. Every time I watch it. Pop the hood. No one likes the tuna here. So thank you guys for watching this little vlog on this drive that I'm doing. Remember, I've got t-shirts in the description, as well as discounts for Hush Performance at bigcartel.com. Links in the description. Please click subscribe if you haven't already. Click like, share this video. Tell all your friends about it. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you guys so much. Peace out.